Today, we are honored to be joined with Texas State Senator Nathan Johnson, who represents Senate District 16 in Dallas. Senator Johnson is a vice chair of the Jurisprudence Committee. He sits on the Administration Committee, Water, Agriculture, and Rural Affairs Committee, and the influential Business and Commerce Committee, where many energy-specific pieces of legislation are heard annually, or at least in each session. Thank you for joining us today, Senator Johnson.
Glad to be here with you.
So to start us off, we're right in the midst of another very hot summer to start with. Texas grid is continuing to experience high demand, both in April and May. We set peak records already for those individual months, and that trend is likely to continue, if not just through these next couple months in the summer, but also in the years to come, as ERCOT is predicting our peak demand to reach close to 150 gigawatts by 2030. That said, the legislature and the PUC have spent a lot of time on the necessary generation side resources that are going to be needed for the added load that we have. But those are going to take some time to develop, thinking of things like the performance credit mechanism or the Texas Energy Fund, which was passed last session, as you know. Meanwhile, we have demand resources like distributed energy resources, or DERs, that could potentially offer near-term solutions to aid reliability and resiliency to the grid now. As a leader in this energy space, and specifically around demand-side resources, can you discuss kind of broadly what you see as what DERs are and how they interest you as a policymaker to start us off?
Well, let's start with the interest part and picking up from your introductory remarks about load growth, demand, heat waves. We might even say something about global climate change if we would be so daring, and I am. It's hotter. It's hotter every year. We have weirder, more intense events on all scales. All these things demand power, whether it's heat, cold, windstorms. We're talking about resiliency in terms of, are there windstorms or hurricanes, which are also kind of windy, lightning strikes, fires, all sorts of things can impair our ability at the transmission or distribution level to deliver the power that people need. As you mentioned, load is growing, both with the increasing number of people who are moving here, the types of industries that are moving here, and a gradual process of electrification among industries. The oil and gas industry itself has been electrifying its services, increasing our demand. Data centers, the AI brain data centers, huge load growth. When you mentioned a 60 gigawatt growth by 2030, to put that in perspective, that's somewhere between 60 and 70% increase above what we have right now in a very short period of time. So DERs come into play in many ways. They'll be here for the long term. They'll be useful in the long term, but particularly in the short term. We cannot build enough generation fast enough to, as a kind of a raw brute generating force, meet the load demands at a residential level or at a commercial level, even with steady weather, right? DERs, distributed energy resources, are small scale. These aren't 1 gigawatt generators. This might be an aggregated group of single 1 megawatt or 500 kilowatt generators. It could be a neighborhood with rooftop solar panels. It could be a commercial battery array, or it could be a bunch of wall batteries in people's garages. So long as they can be viewed in the aggregate, these small point sources can be used to handle localized immediate needs in the case of a distribution system failure, or in larger transmission failures, or in just supply adequacy problems. We now have either backup systems or alternative energy delivery systems that just meet that margin. And it's particularly important for pricing. Texas has, I think it's fair to say, a unique energy market. It's not so unlike other energy markets, but we rely on kind of just-in-time delivery of electricity. It's far more efficient than these kind of structured capacity markets we see around the country in terms of how much is generated, how much is lost. It can be more efficient in pricing, but it's more dangerous, right? Because we don't have the extra capacity by definition. DERs can be there not only when the power fails, but when conditions get tight. Because when conditions get tight, prices go like that, way up, and they're already pretty high. And if you can just buffer those peaks by having a virtual power plant, which is being able to see this array of rooftop solar, or these commercial batteries paired with it, or a demand response, which we'll talk about later, where people reduce their demand, we see that as itself a source of generation. We can shave off those peaks in demand right when we need to. So it can control prices. It can provide resiliency to the grid when it alleviates peak demands or gets us around short-term power failures. And then there's one other effect. Transmission is a big deal in Texas. We can see a scenario, and there's still some technology developing. There's the regulatory landscape is developing, but where we're deploying DERs, particularly batteries, along transmission lines to, if there's too much going into the line, batteries pick it up, right? If there's not enough coming out of the line, batteries can meet the extra demand. So kind of stabilizing some forces. And these stabilizing forces in turn can alleviate the short-term need to build new transmission lines, because transmission lines don't go up in a week, right? Nor does new generation get built in a week. So I really think DERs are a pivotal component in the immediate term, while we build out more generation, while we develop conservation, efficiency, demand response. All of this stuff takes some time, and the DERs are already online and they're getting up much quicker. I think they are a great stabilizing force for us in the short term.
You mentioned it, and you authored SB 1699 in the 88th legislative session, which was passed. It has two parts to that bill. The first part is granting rulemaking authority to allow the aggregation of DERs, like you mentioned, as well as a residential demand response portion that goes in that, and adding a goal for residential demand response for our investor-owned utilities. I was wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit, since that bill has yet to be implemented, and at the regulatory level, how you envision that bill impacting Texas's energy resources. You kind of mentioned the near term, but also in the long term moving forward, when we have those additional resources coming online, and how the interplay looks.
Sure, that bill is a product of, I think, a pretty a good benevolent cooperation among regulators and private industry meeting public needs. The first portion, when I introduced Senate Bill 1699, it was strictly for aggregated distributed energy resources. And that allowed, we talked about what those are, it's DERs, batteries, solar, whatever, to be viewed in the aggregate and managed in the aggregate and regulated in the aggregate. And we'll talk a little bit more about regulation, and I'll start it off here. Regulation is necessary in order for commercial participants to know what's going on, and because they're making bets. And if they don't know the rules, they're less likely to invest in new technology or new systems that we are, frankly, are relying on working. So the PUC wanted to make clear that they had the rulemaking authority to conduct pilot programs and to regulate the implementation of these aggregated distributed energy resources, which are going to be utilized by retail electric providers to provide, virtual power plants paired with other things, the kind of resources we just discussed. But it's still very simple, right? It's not advanced legislation. It's to get us going. And as we take a look at the regulatory effects, as we look at the market response, and then we look at the overall effects on grid resiliency, generation adequacy, consumer needs being met, then we start filling in some details. We look to see, do we need more legislation or a clearer set of regulations to generate the kinds of market outcomes and consumer results that we need? But I think it's a great start, and I think it was a good collaboration among various interested people, including consumers. The other portion of the bill has to do with demand response. Demand response is something that we've had at the industrial consumer level. Entities that use a huge amount of electricity for their commercial processes. They have for years been able to respond to scarcity by shutting down and getting paid to do it. Now, it's a deal they cut, and sometimes it makes people mad, but the fact is it's a pretty effective way to ensure that we can free up some electricity when we need it. Consumers have never had the option, and we're just now starting to implement policies by which a residential consumer can say, hey, I'll shut down. Will you take some money off of my bill? And retail electric providers are figuring out ways that they can hedge their electricity purchases so that they can make money by you saving money. Demand response allows the consumers essentially to participate in the electricity market, similar to the way that large industrial users do. Now, is it going to be a huge, you're not going to cut your electric bill in half, but you will have an incentive to conscientiously use electricity. It has to be paired with equipment that will allow you to participate. So there's some details. But we think, I mean, people who are looking at this in this space, a lot of people who are more knowledgeable than I am believe that there's huge potential for demand response to have a similar effect to the distributed energy resources that we discussed, which is kind of buffering mechanisms when we hit moments of scarcity. But that is going to require more development on the technology side, on the marketing organization side, on the regulatory side. So it's all in progress, but we do have pilot programs underway, and we do see some pretty promising returns on it.
And just a quick follow-up on that one, as far as both residential DER and kind of DERs or aggregated DERs, it seems like a big part of this is going to be cost savings on the consumer part in the long term. Is that something you foresee with adding these type of processes and these different whether it's ECR expanding ECRS or ERS, excuse me, at the PUC and ERCOT or otherwise? It seems like that's going to be potential cost savings for consumers.
I absolutely think it could save consumers money. And in a scarcity energy only market that we have, it's particularly important that we have these buffer points, because prices can go from 3 to 30 to 300 in a blink. And if we can sort of have a circuit breaker in place where people can just turn down their thermostat, right? Or there's a local microgrid that can supply the power that's not coming out of that transmission line because there's congestion. And we haven't yet had time to build another $1 billion line that goes from West Texas to Dallas or Houston. That means we have greater control over our costs. As far as the ancillary services, you mentioned ECRS and other ancillary services, which is for those listening who aren't overly familiar with these terms. Ancillary services are essentially, it's a one-day capacity market. We don't have a big capacity market. We don't procure energy in excess of our expected needs for in a year in advance, but we do for a day in advance. But they're very expensive to operate. So while we want to retain the ability to have that one-day, day-ahead capacity market to make sure that we have the power, it's very, very important. And ERCOT goes to great efforts to make sure that we're going to be okay each day by deploying enough ancillary services. If DERs and demand response can pull down the need for that and help us forecast it, if we know we have these virtual power plants, that we have this level of demand response and it has been successful, if we know that we have these microgrids, these battery arrays, these solar arrays, these aggregated distributed energy resources in place and they are proven, we can forecast our demand the next day better, knowing we can implement those, which means we have to spend less money producing or having on standby energy that we don't use, which means lower prices and greater stability.
Sign me up. I'm always ready for
it. It sounds great, right? But it's of course, it's a lot harder than the theory is. But the theory is being implemented. It is working at small scale. And I think the next 1 to 5 years we're going to see a lot of advancement in perfecting that.
Absolutely. So I know the dust hasn't even really yet settled on the 88th legislative session. And specifically, as we mentioned, SB 1689 is in the process of hopefully being implemented at the PUC. But looking forward, because it always seems like it's coming faster and faster, the next session's down the pike. Are there any potential provisions or considerations that you'd like to see on that specific proposed framework to potentially make it more effective, or is it kind of a wait and see moment for you, do you think?
I think there is more work to be done, and we're seeing a little bit just in the brief window of time between the legislative sessions. The energy efficiency portion, I think, is a little clunky. I think the demand response portion is still a little clunky. It's not smart to be overconfident when you draft and file and pass a bill. If you prescribe everything, you don't quite know what you're doing, you're going to get in the way of some innovative developments, right? Everyone will play by these rules, but you really shouldn't have made them in the first place. So we left it pretty loose. I think we have more information now. I think there's some tightening up. In particular, the incentives to achieve energy efficiency, I think, could use some work in how they're structured. I mean, basically, utilities make money by building stuff. They get a guaranteed rate of return. We're requiring them to achieve certain levels of energy efficiency, and they're pathetically low. I mean, we're not requiring very much, but there's no incentive for them to do better. And I think we're going to need to better align market incentives with energy efficiency goals at both the TDU, the transmission distribution level, and the retail electric provider level. There's a cooperation between those two that's statutorily in place. but it's not very clearly defined, and it seems to prefer one mechanism over another in a ratio that I'm not sure is right. So I know this sounds kind of fluffy, and that's because it still is. We're gathering information, talking to TDUs, talking to REPs, talking to the people who develop computer algorithms that think of how to optimize this kind of thing and that. I think it's not structured to succeed as much as it can, and I'd like to see it get a little bit more precise without getting in the way.
You're speaking our language, that the energy efficiency legislation and the energy efficient goals and things like that are near and dear to our heart at SPEER. So we appreciate you bringing that up.
I appreciate your work on it.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And last thing, I just want to offer up, just give you a platform here. If there's any other energy priorities that you're hoping to discuss in the next legislative session, it could be focused again on this demand side resources, or you can, if there's anything on the cost savings or, customer protections or anything like that, just kind of open-ended question here.
All right, so three things come quickly to mind. First, I do think we need, as we said, we need to do more on demand response and energy efficiency. I think we're going to start thinking, I think we're going to need to start building more transmission. It's a controversial topic, where to build it, how to build it. Is it going to be the brand new high voltage 765 lines or the old 345 lines? It's costly. It requires decades of foresight, but I think the time to get working on that is right now. As far as consumer, I think that people are having difficulty paying their bills. We've seen in some places 40% increases in electricity rates. And you might be able to justify those increases on a market basis, but that's no consolation to somebody who can't pay their bill. Historically, we have had programs that will help people who are struggling to pay electric, who literally can't pay the electric bill this year that they could pay last year because they don't have a marginal income. I am looking into expanding some form of a plan the state used to have that would support local programs to get people through the summer months, the winter, the extremely high electricity demand periods with some sort of assistance in bill paying. Related to that is being more successful at deploying state, local, and federal financing for energy upgrades and efficiency. Sometimes it means new appliances. That typically helps more affluent people more than it does lower income people, although it can help them too. But we're talking about weatherization, insulation, windows, weather stripping, things that are going to lower people's electric bills, which is probably not probably longer term. I would rather see people have more energy efficient homes than subsidize their summer electricity use. But we need to make sure people in the immediate term are able to pay their bill. And then in the near term, we need to try to get their homes and buildings to be more energy efficient.
Absolutely. Well, we appreciate it, Senator Johnson. Thank you so much for your time today. We look forward to learning more about this as the series continues and hopefully speaking with you as the legislative session ramps up here in 6 short months. So really, really appreciate your time.
I look forward to it. Glad to talk with you.
Thank you so much.